Hi, my name is Vaibhav Garg. I'm the Senior Director for Cybersecurity, Public Policy, and Research at Comcast Cable. Today, I'll be presenting my talk titled Covenants Without the Sword, Market Incentives for Cybersecurity Investment. So before I begin, I want to give an overview of what the talk is about. So very quickly, about 2 decades of research in the economics of cybersecurity has focused on market incentives to invest in security solutions. And this research primarily makes the argument that companies tend to under-provision and under-invest in security because they're not adequate incentives to invest in security. And then they make the argument that we need policy solutions to address this misalignment and under-provisioning. At the same time, if you look at the cybersecurity market itself, it has expanded from 3.5 billion in 2004 to potentially more than 1 trillion in 2025. So there's certainly some incentives to invest in security, and especially I'm going to be talking about 7 market incentives to invest in cybersecurity. These incentives have led not only to investments in technical solutions, but also adoption of secure protocols like SSH, as well as security commitments like the ABCs for ISPs, which is the anti-botnet code for internet service providers, as well as cross-sector efforts like the C2 consensus to create a baseline for IoT security. So to start, why is information security hard? About 2 decades ago, Professor Ross Anderson made the observation that we often think of information security as primarily a technical problem. And because we think of it as a technical problem, we try to find technical solutions to that problem. But he made the observation that information security is not just about technology, but is also impinged by economic incentives to invest in information security or to not invest in information security. Specifically, he argued that most customers may have a hard time differentiating between a secure product and its insecure alternative. And because customers cannot make that differentiation, they would be unwilling to pay for a more expensive, albeit more secure product. And because customers are not willing to pay for the price of building additional security, vendors would be disincentivized to spend additional budget to build additional security into their products. So over time, this leads to a market of security lemons, where neither customers nor vendors are putting any money into security. Now, even if customers were able to differentiate secure products from insecure ones, the cost of insecure devices is typically borne neither by the vendor nor by the buyer. So Professor Anderson made the argument that if you have a camera that gets breached and is used to conduct a DDoS attack, well, the cost of that insecurity is not being borne by the customer who bought the insecure camera or by the vendor who sold that insecure camera, but the third party that gets victimized by the DDoS attack. And then finally, as is the case with many information and cyber products, the value of those products or services or platforms or what have you, it often correlates with the number of people using that particular service or product. So the more people you have on that platform, the more valuable it's going to be. And if you add security, well, that can act as friction and can prevent adoption. So to address those network effects, the provider of that particular platform or service or product might want to under-provision security and thereby drive adoption. And there's certainly examples that we can see that refi these arguments. So if you're in the market to buy a smart TV, it can be hard to differentiate a secure smart TV from an insecure smart TV. If you're in the market to buy a smart camera, as we saw with the Mirai botnet attack, it was used to target a third-party DINE and did not have an impact on the people who bought the camera or the people who were selling the camera. And then finally, if you have a smart TV and you have a smart camera and you were trying to buy a set of smart speakers, one of your first criteria is going to be whether those smart speakers are going to be interoperable with the smart TV and the smart camera, and perhaps it is possible that a highly secure smart set of smart speakers would have a harder time being interoperable with the smart TV and the smart camera, and that means that we get that there is this assumption that vendors will build in less security, and that's often reflected in the increase in news stories that we see around security. So maybe 20 years ago, you'd see 2 news stories about websites getting hacked, and maybe today you see 10 news stories about websites getting hacked. But what that ignores is that 20 years ago, maybe you only had 10 websites, 2 of which got hacked. Whereas today, we may have 100 websites, 10 of which got hacked. So even though 20 years ago, you only saw 2 news stories, the actual success rate of cyber attacks was 20%. And whereas today, while you do see a lot more stories about websites getting hacked, the actual success rate is only 10%. And in fact, Professor Eric Jardine from Virginia Tech makes the argument that cyberspace, even though it might feel otherwise, is actually safer than we typically tend to think, because while news stories about cybersecurity incidents and breaches are increasing, the size of cyberspace is increasing at a much faster pace. And unless we take into account the size of cyberspace, it doesn't really reflect the actual threat posed by cyber attacks. And this is certainly validated by the investments in cybersecurity technologies across all sectors. So in 2004, the size of the cybersecurity market was 3.5 billion, as I said in the beginning of the talk. In 2017, it was 120 billion. In 2025, it's supposed to exceed 1 trillion. So the cumulative average growth rate of the cybersecurity market is actually 20%, whereas the typical sort of S&P 500 growth rate for the overall market is typically around 7%. So in fact, the cybersecurity market is overperforming by the overall market by almost 3 times. And these investments in these financial investments in cybersecurity technologies are being driven by market incentives to invest in security. And the first of these incentives is the need to protect proprietary information. So in 2002, Professor Gene Camp from Indiana wrote a paper that media companies would be incentivized to invest in security to protect content. And you can extend that argument to say that any company would be incentivized to invest in security to protect intellectual property. Now, additionally, in addition to protecting intellectual property, your company might have customers with specific security requirements, because those customers in turn want to protect their intellectual properties. So if you're a vendor for a company, you would be incentivized to invest in security to satisfy those security requirements. You'd be incentivized even more if those customers can easily switch to a different vendor, especially if you had a security incident. So with things like software-defined networking and network function virtualization, switching costs have decreased in a lot of different domains, and in those domains, vendors would have an added incentive to invest in security, because then that creates a stickiness for their particular product. Additionally, if you are someone who creates products that are integrated, so the negative security impacts from one product are internalized by a complementary product, then again, you would be incentivized to build a more secure product. One example of this can be ISPs, who also provide gateways and routers to their customers. If they don't build security into those gateways and routers, well, then they'll have to deal with the negative consequences of having potentially malicious traffic on their network. And so again, they're incentivized to build security into those gateways and routers by default. Now, certain companies and certain vendors might actually want to differentiate themselves on security. There's certainly a lot of research that has made the argument that a lot of customers are willing to pay a premium for security, and that there's a big market of those customers. Now, certain companies, and we have seen this in the market, they brand themselves on security and they differentiate their products in security. And those companies would certainly be incentivized to invest in cybersecurity. Now, even if you are not one of those companies, if you experience a security incident, it can have reputational consequences on your annual rate of return, your stock price. It can create additional costs like hiring. You might, after a security incident, you might have to hire additional security professionals, or it can have an impact on productivity. And and certainly on stock price. And the impact on stock price is not necessarily limited to the firm that gets victimized. There's some research that shows that when a firm gets victimized, it doesn't just impact the stock price of that particular firm, but it also has a negative impact on other firms in the same industry vertical. So what that does is it creates an incentive for firms within the same sector to collaborate to solve security problems that require efforts by firms across the sector. And we have case studies of how these incentives have driven adoption of secure technologies as well as investments in security. So the first example is the adoption of SSH. So prior to SSH, the protocol we used was Telnet. With Telnet, your username and passwords was sent in the clear. So anyone who was listening into the network could basically steal your username and password and use it to, steal service from your account. So if you're a system owner who was using that service, you would be incentivized to create a SSH client rather than a Telnet client, because you're trying to make sure that, you're trying to prevent theft of service. At the same time, if you were a system administrator who was providing that service, you would be worried about people using a compromised account to have a broader impact on the ecosystem, either through escalation of privileges or through lateral movement. So you would be incentivized to provide SSH servers rather than Telnet servers. So that double-sided dynamic where both the customer and the provider has an incentive to adopt the more secure technology led to the adoption of SSH. Now, these kinds of incentives don't have to just change behaviors within a particular network. You can have these incentives drive security behaviors across different networks as well. So, for example, the anti-botnet code for internet service providers is a voluntary code of conduct that has been adopted by a lot of ISPs in the United States. And the reason why this sort of intra-sector effort or within sector effort has taken place, again, is because having malicious traffic on one particular ISP's network also has impact on another ISP. So a lot of ISPs, for example, as part of this anti-botnet code, have decided to filter traffic from spoofed IPs, which was one of the ways that people used to conduct DDoS attacks. And then finally, these incentives can also lead to cross-sector collaboration. So the C2 consensus is basically a cross-sector collaboration between multiple trade groups who came together to agree that there must be at least 10 device capabilities that should be considered baseline to provide security for all IoT devices. And again, the driver here is that if you have a vendor who's building or selling insecure IoT devices, that doesn't just have a business cost to that particular vendor, but also has a business cost for the rest of the ecosystem. So one example that comes to mind is that there was a hotel in Europe that was using smart locks, and those locks had a security breach, and the hotel guests were not able to enter into their rooms. So the hotel went back to using physical keys rather than smart locks. So not only that was their cost of business for the vendor who sold those insecure internet-connected locks, but it also potentially prevented other hotels in the same area from switching to smart locks. And then the particular victim, in this case, in fact, went back to physical locks. And so, again, they did not choose a different smart lock provider. So why should all of this matter? Well, the idea here is that you have all these arguments about how we may not have enough incentive to invest in security, that there are not enough market incentives to invest in security. But at the same time, we are seeing significant investments in security across the board. There's a massive growth in investment in cybersecurity technologies, and it is being driven by market incentives to invest in security. So the question we should ask is not whether or not companies have an incentive to invest in security, but what we should ask is what kind of companies or what kind of sectors do these incentives either don't have adequate impact or maybe are not present. And to the extent that they're not present, as we are building cybersecurity policy, we need to make sure that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because there are sectors and there are industries where there are plenty of strong market incentives to invest in security. And perhaps those sectors do not need or should not have the same kind of cyber policy solution as sectors where those incentives are either not as impactful or maybe are not present whatsoever. So that is all from me. I do have a paper that has more details on all of the arguments that I made that is available online on SSRN. You can also search for the paper titled Covenants Without the Sword, Market Incentives for Security Investments, and that should bring that up. So I'll end my talk here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.